Is it true that we are more or less the same on the inside? I don't mean psychologically. I'm thinking of the vital organs, the stomach, heart, lungs, liver, of their placement and function, and the way that a surgeon making the cut thinks not of my body in particular, but of a general body depicted in cross-section on some page of a medical school textbook. The heart from my body could be lifted and placed in yours, and this portion of myself that I had incubated would live on, pushing foreign blood through foreign channels. In the right container, it might never know the difference. At night I lie in bed, and though I can't touch it or hold it in my hand, I feel my heart moving inside me, too small to fill the chest of an adult man, too large for the chest of a child. There was a newspaper article about a man in Russia who had been coughing up blood. An X-ray showed a mass in his chest with a spreading shape, rag-edged. They thought it was cancer, but when they opened him up, they found a 6-inch fir tree embedded in his left lung. Inside a body there is no light. Amassed wetness pressing in on itself, shapes thrust against each other with no sense of where they are. They break in the crowding, come unmade. You put your hand to your stomach and press into the softness, trying to listen with your fingers for what's gone wrong. Anything could be inside. It's no surprise, then, that we care most for our surfaces. They alone distinguish us from one another and are so fragile, the thickness of paper. I was standing in my room in front of the mirror, peeling an orange. I cradled its exact weight in my palm, sinking a nail through the topmost layer. I dug a finger under its skin until I felt cool flesh, then I rooted that finger around and around. The rind tore with a soft, cottony sound, the peel one smooth, blunt piece trailing off the fist of the fruit. I slipped my contacts in and blinked at the mirror. Most mornings I barely resembled myself. It was like waking up with a stranger. When I caught a glimpse of my body, tangled and pale, it felt as if there were an intruder in my room. But as I dressed and put on makeup, touched the little tinted liquids to my skin, and watched the hand in the mirror move alongside my own, I rebuilt my connection to the face that I took outside and pointed at everyone. My hand ripped a wad of pulp and pushed it through the space between my lips. Juice crawled down the side of my palm. Like the moon, my mouth in the mirror seemed to look a little bit different each day. It was summer, and the heat hadn't yet tightened around our bodies, making us sticky and moist, trapping us in a suit we hated to wear. A breeze pushed through the open window, smelling of cut grass, chopped flowers, and I could hear the people outside leaving their homes. Their car doors opened and closed, tires shifting gravel as they pulled out of their driveways and vanished for 8 or 9 hours, only to return less crisp, their unbuttoned cuffs hanging open. I liked letting noise from the neighborhood leak into my sleep and begin turning things real. I liked it, except when I hated it. Hated how close the houses were to one another. Hated that the first outdoor thing I sighted each morning was my landlady's swollen face as she poked her head out the door to grab the newspaper. She lived below us, but from certain angles she could see straight up into her unit. Every day she bent down to retrieve it, then turned around, craning her head to peer in through my bedroom window, checking to see if I'd spent the night in my room. Her changing hairstyle, auburn one week and then a dirty highlighted blonde the next, made it unclear whether she wore real hair or wore a wig, and if it was a wig, whether she slept with it on. My roommate B said it was like she was a fugitive inside her own home, someone living on the run without going anywhere at all. Across the street there was a family with a dog that slept most of the day, but a few times each afternoon it ran to throw itself at the front windows, smashing its muzzle against the glass and barking until the sounds it made warped and hoarsened. I get up from my desk to see what was wrong, but there was never anything to see, not even a squirrel. Sometimes then our eyes would meet, the dog and me, and we'd just stare at each other from across that street, not knowing what to do. It was a safe neighborhood. There was nothing you could complain about without sounding crazy. The sun was bright outside, and I heard birds hidden in the trees, swarming the bushes with sounds of movement, calling out, bending small branches beneath the weight of their small bodies. Thumping sounds came from the other side of the bedroom door. It was B moving around our apartment, one small thump from the living room, and another, and then the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I heard her going to start the coffee maker and then giving up, opening the refrigerator and giving that up too. Standing still in the middle of my room, I tried to gauge how much I could move without letting her know that I was alive. She couldn't assume I'd be conscious this early in the morning, but that wouldn't stop her from checking every 5 or 10 minutes, pausing to listen for the sounds of someone wakeful. Then sometimes she'd sit herself near the door, ear against the door jamb, and talk toward me as though we were having a normal conversation. She'd talk until I responded. B said the apartment was lonely when I wasn't awake. She said that if I was sleeping, I was as good as dead. She meant in terms of companionship. When B did eat, which was not always, she preferred to touch the food as little as possible to keep her hands clear of what she called that edible smell. She needed my hands to cut, to squeeze, to handle, to break eggs and toss their slimy shells into the garbage. We were both petite, pale, and prone to sunburn. We had dark hair, pointy chins, and skinny wrists. We wore size 6 shoes. If you reduced each of us to a list of adjectives, we'd come out nearly equivalent. My boyfriend C said this was why I liked her so much, why we spent so much time together. C said that all I wanted in a person was another iteration of my person, legible to me as I would be to myself. B and I looked alike, talked alike. That was fair enough. To strangers viewing us from a distance as we wove a path through the supermarket hand in hand, we might seem like the same person. But I was on the inside and I saw differences everywhere, even if they were only differences of scale. We looked young, but there was a childish quality to how she slumped over whatever she was doing. We had the same brown eyes, but hers were set deeper in her skull, pushed back so they disappeared beneath the shadow of her brow. We were thin, but B was catastrophically so. I had helped her zip up a dress. I had held her hair back and rubbed the cool, clammy base of her neck with my fingers as she deposited the contents of her stomach into the sink. I knew how her bones looked and how they felt, shifting just below the skin. Whenever I had something nice to say about her or something mean, C would just shrug his shoulders and say I only thought that because we were too much alike. He had a chronic misunderstanding of me. B was fragile and sick and needed to be nursed. She looked underfed. She touched objects like someone who owned nothing in the world. She was cut to my shape and size like a trapdoor, similar enough that I could imagine myself into her, different enough to make that fantasy a form of escape. This morning, though, as I listened to her voice on the other side of the door, I wished that I had worked harder to have our differences. B missed me more the more I saw her. Under her scrutiny, I felt the weight of my own presence constantly and grew tired, irritated by myself, so that day by day I waited a little longer before coming out of my room in the morning, trying to postpone re-entering the construct of my life. Her affection created in me the wish that she would stop loving me, would leave me alone, would let me feel affection for her the way I had when she first moved in, harmless and sad, when I could feel generous for trying to think about why she was sad and come up with ways to make her happy. From the hallway outside my bedroom, her mouth close to the sliver of space between door and molding, B spoke. I wanted to make us some coffee, but we're all out of coffee. I need your help to figure out what kind of juice I should drink. Have you ever had one of those moles that sticks out? I had a dream last night that we were both birds with their wings missing, but we helped each other escape from a box. When we escaped, we were so happy we wanted to celebrate, but we couldn't show it. We didn't have limbs. The summer I found out about the food chain, I was 8 years old. I became obsessed with it in a way that made me outgoing, explaining it to any adult or child who would listen. I drew big maps of predator-prey relations on all my binders and notebooks, webs in which I was always pictured in some topmost corner, near all of my favorite foods. I told my parents that I was going to become an ecologist so I could find out which animals living in entirely different continents or habitats, on land or in water or caves, could eat each other if put in the same place. I would fill in the gaps, and every animal would be linked to every other by a one-way arrow leading from the prey animal to the mouth of its predator. It was an orderly system, like rainwater becoming seawater that dissolves again into little droplets of rain. It was a meat cycle, and when I ate spaghetti with meatballs or chicken noodle soup, I went to bed certain that participating in the meat economy meant that I would be eaten too, someday, by many things larger than me, or by many things smaller. That fall, we moved to a new school district 45 minutes from our old house, and our new neighborhood was greener and wetter than the last one, with more space between the houses. Everyone was a stranger, and in the afternoons I'd go out to the woods behind our house and upend rocks and logs to see what was underneath. Underneath there was a basement smell, and the wood, blackly wet, had a softer texture like damp velvet. I'd flip the log over and watch what was underneath scatter. Black beetles with a permanent shellac to their hard casings, ants of different shades of brown and red, earthworms and shortened white worms with no eyes or faces. With a twig or a long blade of stiff grass, I prodded at them, rolling the worms into the rich dirt, herding a beetle over to a dark divot into which large black ants disappeared into the earth. I tried to feed the small insects to the larger ones. I wanted them all to mix, to struggle, to show me in real time what it meant to live and die. I found an earthworm half submerged in watery soil where it was being eaten by a larval dragonfly. The worm was larger and stronger, its body a single muscle twisting out of the water and flopping back, failing. It struggled, pulling its long body into small arcs and spirals, and this meant nothing to the larva that worked calmly to chew a hole into one of its ends, releasing a thin, cloudy white trail hovering in puddle water. I left my room and went into the kitchen, where Bee sat looking at the fridge. "I don't know what I feel like eating," she said to me. "Maybe you want a sandwich," I suggested. "I can make you a sandwich." The sandwiches I made Bee were white bread, condiments, deli cheese, no meat. Bee claimed meat was hard to digest, but I think she just didn't want the calories inside her. Instead of cutting off the crusts, I squished the sandwich down with my palm to make of it a sort of edible coaster. This was a way of tricking Bee into thinking that there was less food in it. Then I slid it on a plate, cut it diagonally, and handed it over to her. I'd make my own sandwich while, out of the corner of my eye, I watched her pull it apart, remove the cheese, scrape out the fat white center of the bread, and throw it away, leaving only the mayonnaise crusts to chew on. "No, too much," she said. "I don't want to overeat when it's so hot out." "What were you going to have?" "A sandwich," I said. Bee stared straight forward, chewing on her lip as she thought it through. Finally she announced, "Let's have popsicles." Popsicles came in a 50-pack and were bright with artificial coloring, though there were only 3 flavors, red, pink, and orange. Bee loved them, the stuff that was more like a color than a food, loved to eat them day or night as she drank the lemon-scented vodka from the freezer. Since she had moved in, I had been eating more popsicles and less of everything else. Her habits were contagious. One time I asked her why she ate so many of these when she wouldn't even eat a scoop of ice cream. She brought the box and explained that even though they tasted like juice, they were made of something better. Each popsicle contained about 15 calories, and you could burn almost that many just by eating them with vigor. "They erase themselves from your body," she said, as I pulled the box closer to my face to peer into the fine print. Bee came from the kitchen and handed me a popsicle, the waxy wrapper caked with frost, and we crawled out onto the window, onto the roof, the way we used to, and sat out there with the summer heat pressing down on our arms and legs from above. Sweat beaded on the surface of our skin and felt creaturely, like many legs ready to be set in motion. Our popsicles were identical orange, and each was a conjoined twin, bound in the center with sticks projecting from both halves. A navel orange is something similar, the navel, another separate fruit attempting to grow within the base of the first, impacted on all sides, turning dry, infertile, and tasteless as a result. I had just maneuvered myself over to the spot on the roof where I liked to sit, where I could see into my room and also into the kitchen next door and the living room across the street where they had the crazy dog. But Bee had already stripped hers down and was digging in, biting at it first and then holding its beak in her mouth to soften. Sucking sounds came from her mouth as the orange slick pulled around her teeth. She was working at it as though she hadn't eaten for days. I looked over at the house across the street and tried to spot the dog as I tore up my popsicle wrapper, gummy on the inside from popsicle juice, juice coloring my hands as I tried to pull the popsicle from its skin. A bright heat trembled all around us as we ate them, our faces sheening with sweat. Sounds of lawnmowers and birds hung like chains in the quiet air. I favored one side of the popsicle over the other so I could finish it first and have a normal single-stick popsicle to work on. Sweat ran down my forehead and into the eye. Then there was the sound of an engine growing louder, harsh in the heavy afternoon, and we saw the neighbor's car coming slowly up the street. The man was driving, and his wife and daughter were in the car, too. Bee stopped looking to watch the car pull into the driveway across the street, and when she looked down again, she noticed her popsicle dripping. She crawled all over the roof looking for ants to drown in the sticky, bright syrup. She hunched over them, dangling the last nub of it above, turning the stick in her hands to make it drip more evenly. The ants struggled for a bit, and when they had stopped, others came to feed minusculely on the orange slick. I shuffled over on my knees to see them more closely, the dying ones and the ones not yet dying, many trying to eat up the stuff that had killed the others. The live ants looked like they might be distressed, or maybe just excited. I wanted to know which. I hung close above one group, casting my shadow over their swarming, and I waited to see some sign that would tell me whether they were caring for one another or just eating. Bee had lost interest in the ants, but she was looking at me now with intensity. "What are you doing?" she asked. "The ants," I said. "They're dying." Then I thought some of them were coming to help, but actually I think they're trying to eat the syrup. "That's kind of morbid," said Bee. "I don't understand why you tried to kill them," I said. "They never come into the house, and when you kill them this way, it leaves sticky spots all over the roof. We'll have to clean it someday." "They die in sugar," she replied matter-of-factly. "It's the best possible death for an ant." A strange noise came from nearby, and we both stood up to see better. From the house across the street with the expensive-looking hydrangeas and the novelty mailbox shaped like a barn, the house where they had the crazy dog and the daughter who took ballet lessons on Tuesday and Thursday and Friday, 3 figures were filing out the front door. Each one wore a large, plain white sheet over its body with holes cut out where the eyes would be. The largest figure helped the second largest down the front steps, while the smallest struggled out on its own, tripping all over the dragging corners of its oversized veil. Bee and I watched our neighbors shuffle in sheets toward the family sedan. The husband opened the passenger side door for the wife, then walked all the way around to open the driver's side rear for the little girl, tiny under her white covering. Then he walked back up the front steps and into the house. We watched the door for what must have been a long time. Birds fought in the dark interior of the juniper bushes over things that we did not comprehend. The smaller body fidgeted in the back seat of the sedan. Then the father returned, carrying an aerosol can that turned out to be spray paint, cherry red. He stood in front of the garage door, and in large, sagging block letters he spelled out, "He who sits next to me, may we eat as one." The ghost man looked down at his can of spray paint like someone wondering what he had just done and whether he had done it all correctly. Then he set it down in the driveway and got into the car. There was the sound of the engine starting up, the tires grinding against stray rocks, and then they were gone. They had left the front door open. Bee and I stared at the emptied house for a while, then she turned and climbed back inside, stepping over the puddles of popsicle juice and dead ants. I could see corners of their furniture through the front windows, covered over in swaths of white fabric. It looked like a room about to be professionally fumigated, some mundane sort of transformation. I sat there for maybe half an hour watching the empty house for whatever might happen next, but nothing happened next. When the ants started crawling on me, I brushed my body off and went back in through the window. I was still hungry when I got back to my room. I turned on the smaller TV in my bedroom, the one I watched when I didn't want to watch near Bee. The TV was showing another commercial for candy cakes. This commercial was one of the newer series of ads that mixed animated and live-action components. In this new series, Candy Cat would often successfully chase down or otherwise achieve contact with the snack cakes, but the cakes were pictured as live-action, 3-dimensional objects, while the cat was always a flat cartoon. The gag each time was that no matter how hard he tried, Candy Cat could never put a candy cake down his throat. The 2 types of matter were fundamentally incompatible. This went along with an advertising campaign centered around the point that candy cats were made of real stuff. Maybe not natural stuff, but definitely genuine three-dimensional material from our physical universe that was similar to us in ways it might not be to bodies from a cartoon world. In this commercial, Candy Cat walks wobbly through a cartoon landscape full of dancing trees. The trees are shaking their middles and singing the candy cake's jingle as little birds play bells and maracas in their branches. You can see every rib on Candy Cat's brownish body as he wobble-skips through the woods, having what appears to be a pleasant day. He looks fairly carefree, oblivious to his hunger and to the words being chanted all around him by the living trees, when suddenly he happens upon a plate of candy cakes sitting in a clearing in the middle of the forest, three-dimensional and super real among the painted foliage, glowing with a sparkly light that is not real, not cartoon, but something in between. In rapid sequence, he spasms through shock, surprise, delight, disbelief, delight again, and then crippling hunger. His ribs throb. And when he reaches out for the platter, you actually see his emaciation in motion. The skin sags a little off the forearm, the bones and tendons of the arm show starkly with a little drop shadow underneath them to heighten the effect. His eyes grow larger and whiter in their huge cartoon sockets. At this moment, I want so badly for him to just take one of those revolting cakes and shove it all the way into his belly, anything to anchor his body a little bit. But when his hand finally reaches the plate and grabs for a candy cake, none of the cakes will budge. It's hard to describe. It looks like Candy Cat's hand is touching them through the glow, but they aren't affected at all. It's not like they're a photo, but more like they're impossibly heavy, so he'll need something else to move them. So Candy Cat runs out of the frame and gets a comically large fork, and he aims it at the plate and stabs down, but the fork seems to just pass through them as though they're made of nothing, and Candy Cat stabs more slowly and then picks the fork up and looks at it, confused. Then he runs back out the frame and returns with an axe, which just does the same thing, nothing, no matter how many times he hacks away at the plate. Meanwhile, the forest is getting pretty torn up. And when he runs back out the frame and comes back, he's got tons of dynamite, which he sets up all around the cakes and detonates in a huge explosion that turns all the trees and birds black, with little white eyes blinking in stunned disbelief. The platter of cakes glows more handsomely than ever against the scorched background. And finally, Candy Cat just yanks his mouth open with two hands, painfully wide with a cracking sound, and jumps mouth first onto the plate and the cakes, trapping their glow inside his mouth as he lies on the forest floor. His mouth is kind of suctioned to the ground now, and he struggles to close it, drawing the lips together, biting into the soil to prevent any precious morsel from being left behind, and he closes slowly on the mouthful of dirt and plate and cakes. He stands up, shaking, his mouth full. There are big bite marks in the cartoon soil where his teeth have gouged away at the earth. And tentatively, he bites down. It doesn't even make a sound. Confusion shows in his face, and he bites again and again, more rapidly. Nothing. Then, stretching his throat out to the appropriate width, he tries to swallow the plate whole, again and again. Nothing. Finally, he spits out the plate, the cake's perfect and intact, still with that weird magical glow on everything, though now the glow has something smug about it. Candy Cat looks toward the screen, and his eyes have a new wetness to them. Candy cakes, the screen reads. Real stuff. Real good. I looked down at my body as if for the first time. I felt fear wadding up the swallowing part of my throat. I reached down and put my hand on my stomach. I thought about the little swaddled girl in the back of the four-door sedan, so limp and still that she could have been a heap of laundry. I wondered what happened to their dog. There was a bruise on my left thigh that I'd never seen before, and I was hungrier than I'd ever been. On the television screen, the evening news returned from commercial. There had been breakthroughs in the preliminary testing of a new anti-cancer drug designed to heighten the immune system's sensitivity to familiar somatic cells growing at abnormal rates. Half of the animals used in testing showed greatly reduced growth for tumors and other unusual structures, as well as a reduction in the number of new abnormalities. The other half died.